All right, team, welcome to the Ravit Show. We have a very special guest today. It's none other than Tristan Spaulding from Acceldata. Today, we'll be discussing a lot around data observability outside the data warehouse. I'm super excited because we'll be discussing this hot topic, data observability. I also want to ask a lot of questions around AI observability and what's like the difference there. And we'll be talking about this space evolving and the companies about which are in this space, data observability. So can't wait to obviously chat with Tristan about it. A little about Tristan Spaulding leads Acceldata's product team as head of data and is responsible for product strategy and development. Prior to Acceldata, Tristan was product manager at AI unicorn DataRobot, where he partnered with hundreds of leading enterprises on mission critical ML initiatives, developed the product and design teams, and launched DataRobot's MLOps product. So obviously we have that space as well where we can touch a little on MLOps if Tristan would be happy to talk about it and about that space. So definitely touching that as well. And feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go ahead. And don't forget to tag Tristan because this is a recorded session, but wanted to make sure that I'm covering a good ground by playing it for you guys, what we've recorded. So yeah, don't forget to tag Tristan and ask questions. Also, there's a very cool giveaway that we're doing, which is a 365 Data Science annual subscription. You can type in hashtag 365 Data Science in the chat to enter the raffle, and I'll be picking two winners actually from the folks who have put it typed in hashtag 365 Data Science in the chat, and we'll get the ball rolling. So let's not wait anymore, and let's have Tristan here. Hey Tristan, welcome to the Ravit Show. How are you?
Hey, I'm great. Thanks so much for having me. Excited to talk about observability, machine learning, anything we can talk about in the data world here.
I can't wait, Tristan. I was just telling our audience obviously about this itself, where data observability space is so hot right now, and there are so many things that are kind of synced in with it. Today obviously we'll be discussing a lot around data observability outside the data warehouse. So obviously wanting to learn more about it from you, and I know for a fact that you've done a lot in the MLOps space as well. So we can have one or two questions that I'm kind of curious about, so I can learn that from you as well. But for our audience, can you introduce yourself, Tristan?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm fortunate to be head of product at Acceldata. So Acceldata is a about 3-year-old company here in the data observability space that has a quite unique perspective on it. And so I joined about 7 months ago after really being at DataRobot for about 4.5 years. So that was an exciting journey, right? Going from a small startup to now, DataRobot's a powerhouse in the ML world, kind of popularized AutoML and things like this. And and we discovered a lot along the way, right? So I think, for me, the story of how I sort of, came to be at Acceldata really started with, being in this machine learning world and seeing the power that you can do when you deploy these models. But the thing about it, and people may be familiar with DataRobot, machine learning platform, but the thing that's really special about DataRobot is always that it's around automation. It's around saying, hey, if you have the data, if you have the problem framed, we can generate a model for you very quickly, things like that. And we can deploy that model and maintain it, right? And so what we found was great. First use case, awesome. Second use case, awesome. Third use case, fourth. All right, great. Now, even at the largest companies, how many of those companies actually have enough data pipelines and have the data sets that you can rely on to run these problems? What you'd find is you could sort of churn through those very quickly and get huge results, huge value. But what you couldn't do is say, hey, here's 100 problems, data sets ready to go. The data scientist is the binding constraint. And so for me, I was looking at this and saying, hey, what if we push this back a little bit? What if we pushed back in the pipeline here and said, where are things going wrong? These are the nasty areas of every enterprise, right? Is like how the data gets from point A to point B. I think in most companies, it's been, there's decades of investments, really multiple generations of investments in data infrastructure, ETL tools, things like this. So it's a very, very complicated problem. And I think, looking at Acceldata, I mean, the background of the company. So a lot of the company came out of Hortonworks. These were some of the sort of star engineers at Hortonworks, dealt with some of the largest data processing problems, sort of the 2010s basically. And what we're sort of doing here, what we're building here is something that's bringing that, a little bit into the new generation as well, which is a very exciting place to be.
Wow, this is fantastic. And I know for a fact where, you've seen the real transition happening in the last few years. Back then, it was kind of a little different. And now it's obviously, like you just mentioned, obviously it's like new gen thing, which has come up, and you're kind of focusing on that. And you want to make sure that it's something which is new and trending and hot right now, and focusing on that. But that also brings me to an important question. How have you like seeing the data space evolving in the last few years, like 2 to 3 years maybe?
Yeah. I mean, there's just so much happening in it, and I think for me it boils down. You can probably pick out three things. So I think one, you have to start with basically the power of cloud technologies now. So the ability to pick these up, the variety of things out there, like that power and ease of use is just something that's amazing, to someone that. So for me, I started in data, probably about a little over 10 years ago, started doing this stuff. To now be able to say, hey, on Snowflake or Databricks, I just click a few times, I'm set up, I'm able to do this at huge scale. Like it's magical, right? And so I think, that fact has to be embraced. At the same time, this comes with its own challenges, right? So like instead of dealing with sort of a fixed budget and in-house IT and things there, you now have infinite power, but also infinite ability to kind of burn through this. And so, paying by the drink on these can end up, end up on someone's bill somewhere in the So I think that's one trend, is like, you have to acknowledge the power of these things and that you need to be using them, to have basically successful, cutting edge, world-class data pipelines, data processing systems. On the other hand, how do you use them effective, I think, is a big challenge for people. How do you use them effectively? How do you switch? How do you know when there's the next Snowflake coming up and when it's time to switch to that, things like that? How do you know what workload is worth doing on Snowflake versus which is on Databricks? Of course, each of those will tell you, do it on all of them, right? But balancing it out, measuring it, yourself is a little tricky.
True.
I think the other big trend that's significant is really around the use of data and the use of analytics. So, and this is a little bit what I mean by sort of outside, what about life outside the warehouse? So what I mean by that is certainly BI and reporting have been with us for a long time and will be with us for a long time. They're great essential use cases, right? But I think what's happening is like there's other use cases that are emerging that are growing quite quickly. And these are things that actually touch the outside end consumer. So the marketplace outside, sort of the four walls of your organization. So I think two of these use cases basically are, machine learning, AI and machine learning powered use cases where you're bidding essentially either bidding on ads, you're bidding for customers through churn, through offers, you're optimizing your supply chains, all of these things. You're actually competing with someone outside who's doing the same. I guarantee you someone's doing the same thing. They're trying to get your customers, you're trying to get their customers, you're trying to hang on to your customers, they're trying to hang on. Like your models are battling whether you know it or not. And so I think that's a huge element that's a little different in terms of the requirements than maybe the dashboarding reporting of old. I would say the other one that's quite significant is actually direct data monetization. So if you look at this, like there have been data providers for a long time that are well known that provide data, can be used for models, can be used for reporting, but basically to enrich that. I think what we're starting to see is this is accelerating quite a bit. So that used to be, let's say 20% of companies, had some foot in that. I think I've seen estimates now, from IDC that this is getting to 40% over the next couple of years here. So going from a place where you have data, it may or may not be an asset for you. You may or may not be using it. But again, there's someone out there in the marketplace that, they could be building models, they could be doing reporting. They're looking for that data. And that data has value if it's good, if it's on time, if it's reliable. And so I think this shift in use cases or this emergence of new use cases basically is the second piece that I think is quite interesting shift and a big opportunity for people within companies and also for startups.
Right.
I guess that would be my third one. So, I think first is cloud data technology. Second is the shift in use cases. I think third is basically the explosion in the supply and the specialization of tools. So I think this is pretty clear at this point. If you follow, a show like this and you're following along, it is impossible to keep track of the companies that are emerging and the new tools that are out. It's very exciting things. Everyone has a perspective, right? But people try to I think, say, modern data stack or things like this. I think it's just a
Exactly.
heap of things. It's just like making sense of that and organizing it. Like every company has their own, diagram of the so-called modern data stack where they're in this.
Very true.
I think realistically, it's just a heap of like hundreds and hundreds of tools that might or might not interoperate in good ways, that might have this trajectory or that trajectory. So even going through, for example, pipeline orchestration tools, like there are some awesome things in here. And beyond the stalwart, Airflow, there are a number of awesome frameworks on top of this. But if you're, in an enterprise and you're evaluating this, it's really just almost impossible to keep track of these. And so on the one hand, you can kind of, stick with what works, right? You can kind of be scared off of this. Do I need a metric store? Do I need a feature store? What is a feature store? Like, why can't I do that? And then stack ranking, like which ones of these do I need to invest in first? Extremely difficult to do. So I think, there's this like paradox of choice type of situation for a lot of things that basically, because of all the awesome tools in the market and things there. So I think that's tough. Like there's no easy answer to any of these, right? These are tricky challenges for people to face, but I think, at least that's sort of what we see when we talk to our customers and look out at the marketplace. Yeah.
Wow. I think this is fantastic information in terms of the, the space evolving. Obviously, you spoke about cloud data technology use cases, and then obviously the modern stack, which is very, at the moment it's super hot. And obviously, as you mentioned, it's obviously hard to, pick one tool and say, or maybe,
Right.
pick one modern data stack created by a company or maybe the other. There are different, I guess, the diagrams like you mentioned that everyone has created. But as a head of product, do you kind of get intrigued with these modern data stack diagrams? Do you kind of, feel that, okay, this does make sense, or are you like kind of neutral on that front, Tristan?
Yeah. So the interesting thing about Acceldata's perspective on this is like we're basically a partner to large enterprises, right? We very much have a very clear segment where we focus, where we've had success, and like where we continue to invest. And so for us, like we kind of have an advisory role in this. So our goal is like
Nice.
we acknowledge that you may have things that are in pretty old databases and have existing pipelines with drag and drop ETL tools, that shall not be named, but that you might have had running for 20 years, and so we know that doesn't go away, right? And so at the same time, we know within these groups, there are different pods that are using different things. Some people are using Airflow and they realize they have, 700 Airflow pipelines or something like that. They don't actually know how many, right? And then over here, someone's saying, hey, Dagster is cool. Like, can I do that? So our perspective at Acceldata is like, we're about basically, being able to instrument these and basically pipe this back to a central view. So we love innovation in this. Like we love, from a strategic perspective, it's sort of like strengthens Acceldata's value proposition to have a lot of these around here, because we basically, are neutral between all of these and try to plug into them. That said, it's tough to keep track of it, right? It's like how many hours in the day to know all of these. So to some extent, we're very much guided by customers too, and look at, okay, well, these are the databases that are here. Let's look at those. These are the challenges we're facing when we, have adopted Snowflake. These are the challenges we adopted with Databricks. This is something you can help with.
So it's it's not just one way that you're looking at things. Obviously, you're kind of having the customer perspective in there. You have like an advisor which kind of sits in with you and obviously kind of shares the best practices out there. And also you love to check the funnel in and out and see what's kind of the best and is hot right now. Does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, I think it's, we try to keep the rest of it and just sort of be guided with people. I mean, I think it's clear, I would just point to maybe the cloud, data platform adoption challenges. Like the benefit is so high, but also the cost and complexity is quite high as well. Not necessarily for the end user. The end user has a magical experience. That's awesome. But if you take this out to someone who owns that data, the person who's paying that check, out to the, to the cloud data platform or to the underlying cloud service provider, that person is paying attention to this and looks at this. And so this is an angle where, Acceldata has a unique stance here, right? So Acceldata's take, I'd say unlike, it's a little different from other data observability sides. So with Acceldata, we basically say like, hey, for you as the data platform owner, for you as the CDO, we're trying to be your best friend and tell you, are your data pipelines working? Both in the sense of, is the data coming through and is the data good? But also, are you actually, spending a sensible amount? Are you wasting money? Are you blowing through your budget, that you had for the year in 3 months because someone's using an interactive cluster and they should be using an all-purpose cluster? So things like that. So I think it's a little bit, different perspective that, it's technically like quite hard to build a product, that does this together. And so that's kind of where we spend a lot of time, right? But it's something that ends up paying off as these large companies transition to adopt the cloud.
No, I totally agree. And it's something, obviously with time, obviously you need to evolve, and it's like so fast when it comes to a product building that you have to be up to date and you have to be there on your toes. And hats off to you and your team, Tristan, for building and doing great stuff at Acceldata. Definitely. That also, obviously, since we are on this topic, that brings me to a very important question and something that I eagerly ask everyone on the show. And that's something around the words that we've been listening since almost a year or two now. And that's like about data mesh, about data fabric, about data lake. But what's your take on that, Tristan?
Yeah, so I think I would kind of bucket data lake separate from the other one. So I think data lake has a solid meaning, established in the Hadoop years that continues now on maybe more efficient technology. But a place where you're sort of locating data and then worrying about the semantics of it later.
Right.
So that kind of makes sense. And then aquatic metaphors are always good. It's like, this is the data swamp, all these things. Like, I think people get that now. I think the data mesh and data fabric is a little different. Like that I've seen emerge, and I think it's basically, to me, it boils down to actually being very much tied to the cloud data platform shift. And so what I mean by that is that if you think about this, it's not just that the cloud data platforms give you a lot of flexibility and ease of use. They also shift your interaction model. If you're a data team, they make it possible to kind of interact without your central IT group as much and more directly with the cloud vendor. And so what that means is, like, you can have more decentralization because you kind of have a central trusted authority. It's just that is actually a commercial vendor. It's not your central IT team. And so I kind of take data mesh, data fabric as, a reaction to that possibility and the organizational shifts that it unlocks, where you now can have teams that they may not be incredibly deep on the technology, and like may not be able, like they wouldn't be able to configure Hive and things like this. But if you're using, a cloud data platform, you don't have to configure Hive. Like, you need to say, hey, use this service, launch it, bill me, things like that. So I think that's where that metaphor, I think, starts to, in my view, that's what it kind of boils down to. Yeah. Is like, hey, when we're, people talk about different ways to move to the cloud. I think there's, it's like, you can re-platform, there's like the 7 R's or things like this. Like, but I think like data mesh, data fabric is saying, in my view, like, don't just lift and shift your organizational model that you've had for 20 years around data analytics to the cloud. Like, redesign your organizational model to be more decentralized, interact more with the central cloud provider, and less have a global standard on everything, at least on technical choices. So I don't know. I think it's interesting. I think it's, what you see more generally is just such a explosion in the the meaning of the roles and the shift in the meaning of the roles. So a data engineer versus a data reliability engineer versus an ML engineer versus an MLOps engineer versus a data scientist. This stuff means different things everywhere today. And like tomorrow, data reliability engineer, data steward, data quality, it's like these things kind of shift around. And so I think people are trying to find a way to phrase it that basically means, hey, some of the skill sets that used to be a barrier to owning things end to end, maybe those aren't a barrier anymore. And how do we as a company embrace that, in a more flexible way? So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think, from an Acceldata strategy perspective, I think one of the reasons we kind of see the data compute, and the pipeline visibility and data reliability kind of like make sense as one product together, one unified product, is essentially this, right? That you're going to have people who, you can't run a cloud data platform and not know about the data workloads running through it. Like, you have to be able to see that data, see if it's broken, because you're paying by the SIP, right? Someone runs something through, they're running these queries, turns out the data was bad, they need to run it again. Like, that adds up, right? Similarly, your data is slow. You don't know if you get alert, hey, my data's late, what's going on? You can't solve that without knowing, what was going on with Snowflake at the time, what was going on with your Databricks job at the time, what was going on with your streaming job that fed all of this, right? So for us, we're more about, having the place where you blend these together, and I don't know, I think sometimes that union of different skill sets, shifting of skill sets, that's where some, great technologies and, great innovations can happen.
Wow, I love these insights. And like you mentioned, obviously, with all the positions out there, talk about data engineer, machine learning engineer, or MLOps engineer, or data scientist, data engineers, everyone out there have a different definition to it. They have different technology that they are kind of using, different tools altogether, which we have been using. So it's kind of tricky to get that right, but definitely it's something which the insights that you have shared makes a lot of sense. And that also brings me to a very important question, and something that is hour of the topic of the hour, and that is more on the lines which is it seems that more of the data pipelines being used for critical data originate and end outside the data warehouse. So can you explain what's happening and what's the impact, positive, negative, or maybe neutral, it has for teams managing data environments? Because it can get tricky, I know.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of use cases. So I think one that's interesting is in the data provider use case. So in many cases, if you're a data provider, you're ultimately taking files and ultimately in many cases delivering files to someone. So that's a simple example where, like, from a traditional data warehousing perspective, you get it in the warehouse, you query the warehouse, end of the day. If you're tackling one of these new use cases where you're taking something outside, it's not necessarily coming from the warehouse. So the delivery point post warehouse is a little different. I'll talk about pre-warehouse in a second. Similar thing with machine learning models, like models, and this is true whether or not you get into like the feature store concept and things like that, which we can talk about or not. But like there's a phase out, like the models in most cases these days like are going to live outside of your data warehouse. Like I know there are ways to push them down, and you can do that in certain cases, but like in most cases it's going to be outside. So like actually understanding what happens after data leaves that and goes through this other system that's doing this processing, that's essentially putting things on it. Eventually you're going to need to capture the labels for the predictions that you make, analyze that. So things don't end when you get into the warehouse anymore. And I think that's a little different. Now upstream, I think what's quite interesting is like basically, if you think about anything where you're basically taking data off a device somewhere, where you're taking something off of your website, measuring interactions there and analyzing that, like that is not getting dumped directly into your warehouse. Like that's going through likely some streaming platform, most likely some sort of data transformation and aggregation and joining phase as well. And then it's going into your warehouse, and then you could be querying it, you could be doing something else. And so I think what's fascinating is two things on this. Like, so one, I would say there are vendors that will say, all of that comes all in one. Like I'm personally not of that opinion. I think, at the present state and probably forever, there will be best of breed tools for streaming, large scale transformation, and basically, data warehousing, BI, OLAP queries, right? And so what that means is like, you're going to have to understand what's happening across this. You need to be able to look across this. Like you're not going to get one vendor that's going to look at this and just your OLAP, it's your data warehouse. Like they don't know what happened upstream. Likewise, if you're monitoring streaming, you don't know what happened downstream. I think the other big aspect of that is that you may not be an expert. Like if you're a data engineer, you may not be an expert in, like, just to take three examples, like Confluent, Databricks, and Snowflake. Like, especially with the pace these companies are delivering features, which are awesome, like you're not going to be an expert in that unless you're spending all your time reading release notes and experimenting with new stuff and not doing your day job, right? So I think it creates kind of a specialization and optimization challenge. Like how can you as a human data engineer with a day job really be best in class in all of these? So I think that's one trick on this. I guess the other aspect though is if you think about this, so in most cases, I would say, traditional data quality and data quality monitoring, like which has been around for a long time, like that really like works on the data warehouse, right? Like it might be pushed down, it might be on it, but it works in that phase. I think, increasingly there's a need, and this is something that's sort of our, we found a good fit with our customers on. Increasingly there's a need to catch this data upstream. So like you have this, concept of like shifting left in software, in DevOps and testing, things like this, like shift earlier upstream to catch the problems before it contaminates something else. This is something that's a little bit of the, a wish for everyone. Like it's very difficult to do this. This is something Acceldata, can do for some streaming systems, but it's quite difficult, right? Like it's not easy, and like it could definitely be improved on all these fronts. There's also, streaming is one of those areas that has 20 different options, all of which are like very cool and evolving at different rates. But it is something where like in the cloud world, that has a significant cost impact, right? To catch a problem, on the left, when it comes in at scale and speed, before the data has been reduced, before it contaminates everything else and burns through compute costs. So I think that's where, especially if you're tackling these new use cases, or you've got something where you're powering a product experience with data, like latency on that end to end, it's going to need to go through several systems, and like that latency is a big deal. Like, you hear SLAs like has to be done in 2 seconds. Like I need to give them a recommendation or an approval like in 2 seconds, right? End to end across getting the data off the device, going through all these things, back out to the device, right? So that's serious, like, data engineering. It's quite, so you need to be using the best tools, and it's quite hard to optimize them. So I think these are some considerations that, yes, for reporting use cases, like, if it's a monthly report, weekly report, I don't think it's like mission critical, but I think it's for these new use cases where things like this become quite significant. You can't only optimize on the warehouse, you have to optimize on the whole stream.
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense there. Also, since we are on this topic, I have another question for you, Tristan. And one of the keys for managing data is correlating events across data, compute, and pipeline layers. How are data engineers supposed to do this when they are working with a seemingly endless supply of data pipelines and sources? So how do you, as a head of product, how do you look at things, and how do you kind of solve problems for your engineers out there?
Yeah, so I think data engineers like are adjacent to the machine learning world, right? Like they often are the ones, the unsung heroes making these use cases possible, right? And so I think data engineers, deserve some data science help as well. And I think this is one of the areas where that can come in. So if you're taking time series of data, observations basically, or data aggregations, and you're taking time series basically of compute metrics and query loads and memory consumption, things like this, like there are a number of things you can do to kind of correlate these and see which things move together and which things precede others, and sort of what the clusters are across this. So this is something that we sort of have taken on, in certain platforms, right? And, it really is something that takes the time to identify what the problem is, like way down here. So it's very tricky to do. If you think about the scale we're talking about here, like if you imagine doing this for, basically like every column in a warehouse, or every phase, every checkpoint, in a data pipeline for every column, also looking at all the metrics, like it's an immense problem, right? It's an immense problem. There's no way a human can sift through that stuff. And, it's also quite challenging machine learning and technical problem there as well. So I think this is going to be an area, Acceldata aside, like across the industry, like I hope that we're going to see a lot of competition and investment on this, right? Because I think data engineers, get some powerful tools. They don't always get easy to use, hey, let me solve this problem for you tools that spotlight the issue. So that's certainly one of our, North Stars in our design philosophy, our product philosophy is like, let's digest this and crunch this for you and kind of point you in the right direction. But I think it has to be a type of, signal analysis, and sort of time series clustering that kind of leads you to what's happening here. And there'll be a lot to come here in the industry. Like it's going to be an exciting thing, I think.
Yeah, I can't wait. Definitely. It's something which is, out there booming right now. It's going to be something which will be game changer for all the data engineers out there. And obviously there'll be a lot more discussion about it, and lot of investment that will be going in this space. So yeah, I'm super excited. Also that, obviously we've spoken about, I know about various things here, but now I have a question around data observability, and how does data observability fit into all of this? Like you say that it obviously it's not related not to just the visibility, but to the health of data pipelines. And how does that happen? Like,
Yeah. So I think observability. So just to set aside data for a second, I mean, I think in the software world, like there's been a lot of discourse on like what's the difference between monitoring and observability. And
exactly.
I think broadly, like I think there's two traits that are viewed, and people can debate it, but that are viewed to distinguish this. Like I think one is that observability is basically around things that you write, whereas monitoring is usually, hey, it's a third-party service, what's happening. I think the other aspect is that observability is really related, like with an eye towards debugging. Like, what are you going to change? Like, what action are you going to take, to fix this, like in your code, to fix the problem, right? So that's what observability. So you have to be able to understand, what's happening outside and map that to the underlying cause. And so I would say, like, people should keep those criteria in mind as they think about the category. Like, I think observability sounds cool and like is much more powerful, right? And that's why people have sort of done that in the software world. I think there's a debate to be had, like if you were sort of scoring things on like, hey, is this a data quality monitoring tool that's called a data observability tool, or is this a data observability tool that's going deep? Like that would be a debate that people could have on a lot of things, right? Like data quality monitoring. And by the way, like I've spent a lot of time on model monitoring and things like this. Like that is hugely necessary. Like I don't think there's anyone in the world that's happy probably with the amount of, trust they have in their data and in their data pipelines, right? So like, I'm not dismissing data quality monitoring. What I'm doing is drawing distinction between having a great, automatic diagnosis of, hey, there's a problem, and like having something that says, oh, there's a problem here, like the root cause is this, fix this thing, and that'll be good, right? Like, and sort of taking something to resolution. So I think for me, like, if we're going to live up to, as an industry, basically to the term observability, and not sort of be a new wave of the tools of the 90s, that tell you about data quality and things like that. Like we need to get, not only into better recommendations and automation, but more into, okay, what's the root cause of this? Like where in the pipeline did it happen? And what do I do to change that? And so to me, there's no way, I mean, if you go through these things, there's no way to solve this without understanding the data and the compute side. Like, and the great thing about cloud data warehouse is like you actually can line these up like a lot more easily than maybe in the past. So I think that's our big, controversial, conspiracy thing at Acceldata, right? Is like that you can't solve these problems and make your data pipelines run well unless you are able to correlate and basically move seamlessly between the data layer at which you're seeing, the actual data values flowing through and the aggregations there, as well as the actual data compute layer where you're understanding what's happening in Snowflake, Databricks, Confluent, any of the systems underneath here, and what's happening with those transformations.
Yeah, I think it does make a lot of sense. What I can, obviously hear from you is data kind of plays a very important role here. And, trusting the data is very important. And what do you think, when you don't have like, why is first thing trust so important with the data, and what happens when that doesn't exist? I'm curious to know more about that,
Yeah.
Tristan.
So, I think there's a couple interesting things about this. So I think trust, people are very familiar. This comes back to the use cases, right? So I would say this comes back to the use cases. So, if you look at the classic use case of reporting, like if you worked in data, like you all felt the pain, right? Of like, you're showing a report to someone, you're trying to influence a decision and a choice, and it's like, hey, this data is wrong. This number's wrong. Like, where did you get this? That can't be right. Right. And you try to scramble, you're like, all right, trace this back. Like, where did this come from? Or like, hey, this data is late. What happened in the pipeline? Like, that panic, right? And people feel that panic for that use case. And so you say, hey, what happens if you don't trust us? Well, people just ignore all the work we did and go with, their gut, basically. And that's the scenario for this. Now, I think what's more, like, that's still there, and that'll be there forever. I think what's more interesting actually is like what happens in these other use cases. So if you're in this other use case and you're selling your data, like you are taking your data and you're saying, I'm providing this as a service for money, basically to someone else to join to their data and aggregate and use. And like you think like Snowflake, for example, is investing quite heavily in making this marketplace, and that's from someone coming from the machine learning world, like that is awesome. Like, that's how you get better models and better sorts. So it's very exciting. But if that data is wrong, and it's not about whether you trust it, it's about whether your customers trust it. You know, like if your customers don't trust it, guess what? Like your revenue goes down and like you lose that. And if you're a CDO that, or someone reporting to the CDO that had a metric around, hey, monetize our data, hit this number, don't be a cost center, be a revenue center, like that's going to impact you, right? So it becomes like a shift from the internal to the external. Same thing with machine learning. So, you know, this one has both sides. So if you don't trust what your model is putting out, you know, you may be less likely to rely on it at all. Like you may just say, look, we don't want to, like, this doesn't pass the threshold of like, is it more trustworthy than other tools? I think there's also a huge, like the thing with machine learning is like, there's a huge reputational and basically like, you know, regulatory, in many cases, risk to having models out there and basically data out there that you don't trust. If you don't know what this model is doing, like, you know, you're going to show up on Twitter one day with people, you know, sort of highlighting, you know, what you did wrong, and there's going to be a flare up, or, you know, you will get like, you know, this stuff doesn't go unnoticed. And like, I think we would all bet on that scrutiny increasing, right? So I think it's another one where it's like, you know, it's not completely external, but it is, the framing is a little different. It's not about whether will this consumer of a dashboard do it. It's like out in my company, and will they be mad at me, and will they think badly of my department? It's like, will I succeed with this offering I'm putting out in the market? Because I think the last point with that is like, you know, imagine from the dashboarding perspective, you're putting this in, like, what are you competing with? You're competing with an alternative version of yourself, basically, that says, hey, we deliver this dashboard faster and more reliably with a good number. Like, that's what you're competing with. Once you put something out in the market, whether it's a model or prediction or data-powered service, or it's your actual data set yourself, you're competing with the world. Like, you're competing with everyone, right? And you're in the market now. And the good thing is you can make money off the market. You can, you know, have great wins. But the other thing is you can't slip up, right? Because people are going to be pushing. And so I think it's a little, again, just a little different mindset. Like, it's not like one is more important than the other, but I would say one is newer than the other. And figuring that skill set out and kind of adapting to that, that's something that we spend some time thinking about. You know, how do we make sure that, you know, you're not just covering the things you needed for dashboarding, you're covering the things that you need in order to have your data out there, whether directly or through a model, like in the outside world, competing with everyone else who's investing in this, which is a lot of people now.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Like, trust is a big thing, but it's like, I think it's more interesting problem than it was 5 years ago, you know, when not as many people had sort of gotten into trying models and trying to monetize their data directly.
No, I really like your, you know, obviously, Tristan, your thought process here when you talk about data and trusting data, because it's not only just internal game, but when, like you mentioned, the CDO example, obviously it's the game which kind of goes out there and then it becomes external from your customers end as well. So that brings me to a question which is more around the side of data governance. So when you're wanting to, you know, obviously get into data observability and, you know, when you want to trust the data, so how does GDPR, or maybe not GDPR in particular, but maybe, you know, data governance kind of play an important role in data observability, or how do you tackle that problem? Because I know for a fact, you know, data are in many places, and for your clients as well, you might have like it in different countries. So how do you manage that?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, this is the other thing I think that flows from both new use cases as well as new data platforms, as well as frankly the fragmentation of the ecosystem, right? And so what I mean by that is that you know, one problem is just knowing what's where, right? So if you have something, you know, where you're dealing with the data warehouse, there are awesome catalogs, like great catalogs, basically for data warehouses that tell you about the queries you're running, you know, great data governance tools, things like that.
Nice.
The problem is if you're building Airflow pipelines over here to power a model, it's like they just are in a different world, right? They're not, you know, they're not in the purview of your platform, right? And they may not have the annotation. And so I think it's, you know, it's basically a question of like, as the ecosystem, as you get these tools that are incredibly easy to adopt, like how confident are you that, you know, that person writing those pipelines over there isn't using, you know, a protected attribute in a way they shouldn't be, whether that's for a model or whether it's sensitive data. Like, and I'll tell you, like, this is not a hypothetical question. Like, this is a real question that you know, people basically ask us, right? Is like, okay, tell us, like, you know, about these Airflow pipelines. I've got some number of them, you know, I'm not sure how many exactly, you know, I'm not exactly sure what's going through them, right? Can you tell me what's going on with those? Like, apply data governance to those. And so that's why I think for us, you know, we, we don't describe ourselves as a data governance tool, I would say. So like, certainly there's an aspect, right? But I think it's more of an adjacency. So, we sort of like look at, integrations and partnerships and say, hey, like, you guys are the data governance tool. You know what goes where, what's supposed to be where. What we're going to do is give you visibility to what's actually happening in this modern ecosystem, right? Like, we're going to tell you what's there, and we'll line those two things up and make sure you have a view into, okay, like, for the rules you've defined in your sort of governed world, how does that apply in kind of the wild west here of the modern data? I don't think it's a stack, but the modern data, jumble or whatever, modern data heap. And so I think that's kind of the connection, right? And that's going to get trickier because those policies, it's only getting more strenuous, especially when it comes to new use cases around machine learning or around data, monetization, basically. Like, how much can you prove that you've like you've de-identified these records, anonymized the records, like, how much can you prove that? So I think it's going to be interesting. Like, it's not going to get any easier, I would say, for people, right? And I think it's going to be hard for one company to pull it off. Like, I think it's really going to be through connections between companies that have, on the one hand, great insight into like the policies and the governance and how things should be, and on the other hand, companies that know how things actually are and kind of line those two things up together pretty well.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense when it comes to data governance, because it's huge. It will keep evolving. The policies will keep changing. You need to run up to that. And like you mentioned, obviously it will be difficult for, I'm so sorry. Oh my. Yeah. So, like you mentioned, obviously it will be difficult and it will be challenging. So that makes a lot of sense. Also, that brings me to a question which is more on the lines where, the data reliability kind of plays an important role. So we obviously spoke about, data mesh, data fabric, data lakehouse, and also, data governance. But for me, I feel data reliability is super important at the same time. And how do what's your take there? Can you tell us more about data reliability?
Yeah, so I think data reliability, the way we think about it is an attempt to kind of address these multiple use case things. So I think data quality to me maps pretty well to, BI use cases, which is an important use case. Like, are these things in the right bounds? Like, are there nulls, things like that. I think reliability is trying to get at something else where, we talk about like a site reliability engineer, like that person is about, signals that are not necessarily static, they're dynamic. There's something you can jump into after the fact versus sort of tests and things like that. So I think there's a big, there's a little bit of a difference in emphasis of like, is this more like a APM tool where like when there's a fire, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to know what happened, and I'm able to bug it? Or is it something where like, I'm going to define, kind of my rules and it's going to pass my unit tests and then I'm good. So I think that's a little bit of the shift in emphasis is like, is people are thinking more about, some of these newer use cases where things are going outside your company and affecting the outside world.
Yep, makes sense. Okay. Also, Tristan, in terms of, since we obviously touched a little on the modern data stack, but how do you see multidimensional data observability for modern data infrastructure at Acceldata? How does that work?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of our term basically for what we think is our central, central belief, like the thing maybe we believe that not everyone believes here, which is that you need these two dimensions closely connected. Like they're really not even two dimensions. They're one dimension viewed from two sides, right? So understanding the data coming through and understanding the compute platforms moving it. So that's our, those are two dimensions. I don't know. We could probably come up with fewer syllables in that, but I think we also, kind of want our product to speak for itself. Once you start using it, it makes a little more sense.
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense. Awesome. So, Tristan, in terms of, I know for a fact we've spoken a lot in, just wanted to, obviously make sure that we are covering a ground for our audience in terms of the data issues that happen in, the precision. So my question is basically more on the lines where, considering how widespread, all of this data, and how is it possible for you to, start predicting the data issues before they happen? What kind of precision can you get? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question, right? Because it's it's been very fashionable in the last few years, I think, I think people call it, AI washing or things like this. Like you kind of say, oh, it's smart, things like that, you know. But I think the fact is, this is something we saw at DataRobot again, right? Like, like your model, like a different data set may or may not yield ability to predict a certain thing, and it may be able to predict that thing with a certain level of precision or not. And so, really before you're giving these forecasts and before you're saying, hey, this is anomalous, like you really need to be building that model in the right way and validating, hey, this is actually an accurate model. And just because it's even then, like just because it's an accurate model, you can tell you're talking to someone that's like been like thinking about MLOps and model monitoring and machine learning lifecycle, right? But like, just because you built that model once, especially for time series models, just because you built it once, doesn't mean it's going to be good, in a week, right? So there's actually really a serious embedded data science piece to a lot of this, where it's not going to be possible to say, one or the other, like how can you do it? It's going to be on each case. Like the system that's using these models has to be doing a good job. It has to be building the models in the right way. And so I think like the short answer is like, and the not exciting answer is like, it varies, right? Like if you've got data for 90 days down to every 5 seconds, and you can decompose that by different segments, like maybe you can go through and you can find a strategy, but it's really going to be dependent on the data itself and whether you should do that. So what I hope, we see more of, like just in the industry, is kind of like, as we're providing these forecasts, like let's give a measure of the accuracy, right? Like let's peel back the curtain a little bit and say, hey, well, with this one, like, to be honest, like we couldn't find a signal. So, we'll just keep plotting and we'll tell you when we can find a model that's right. Or we say, hey, like, guess what? Like we have really high confidence in this forecast up to 7 days, but not up to 14 days. So feel good about our 7-day forecast, feel a little shaky about our 14-day forecast. So I think especially for data engineers, like data engineers build this stuff every day, right? Like
Exactly.
data engineers are powering these things. They know how the sausage gets made on these. And so I think we're gonna try to lead the way, and I hope the whole industry, around data observability really puts a lot of work into like making these models super high quality and quite transparent.
Nice. What I can hear is, obviously, ultimately being able to manage data means you can also reduce operational cost, like, cost overruns, bad output, unplanned outages, etc. So also, can you tell us more about that side of the game?
Yeah.
How does that happen?
So I'd answer this by looking at like kind of this new job that there is called a chief data officer. And so the chief data officer is like, it's not a role that's been around forever. It's an emerging role and it's an evolving role. And so I think initially, there was perhaps a wave where it largely was a cost, half a cost reduction role, and let's consolidate our technology usage, let's rationalize it, things like that. Let's negotiate good contracts, understand our assets. I think there's also a role now, or a type of CDO now, that's more focused on, hey, I am a revenue production area. Like, how am I going to go on offense here and make investments that are going to have a certain return on the capital that we put into that? And you kind of have to at this phase, right? Like, these are serious, the revenue that companies like Snowflake and Databricks show and the growth, like that revenue is coming from somewhere, and those people are spending money and they need to get value out of it. So if you're investing, hundreds of millions of dollars on data technology per year, you need to be tying that back to something that's more than, hey, our reports ran on time this time, or our reports went from 1 minute to 1 second, things like that. So people are looking for ROI out of it. And that's where I think, there's two sides to it, right? Like you can reduce time, assuming you have sort of a, relatively fixed amount of investment you can make in people and how quickly you can hire, you can reduce the time that people are spending on kind of maintenance and non-revenue producing activities. And you can increase basically the effectiveness and the time that they're spending on new revenue generating activities, which this is not an exact match between, between like, let's say on-premise and cloud, but there's probably some overlap here. Like a lot of these newer applications are going to be more cloud-based. And so I think from Acceldata's perspective, like we kind of look at both, like, and it's a messy, like I'm telling you, like it's not easy to look at on-premise architectures, Hadoop architectures, and understand what's going on those in depth, deal with those, and also do the same thing on the cloud environment. It's very difficult. And so I'm very lucky that we have some great engineers here and a large team to do that, right? But that's actually what you need to do, right? Is hit both sides of this. Because like if you look at the amount of time and effort and money that's spent, maintaining and running and operating existing infrastructures, even if you want to migrate to the cloud, and you've signed your 10-year agreement with whichever one of the cloud vendors, like that's going to take years to migrate. Like that's not going away tomorrow. And until it goes away or you find a product or service to reduce that, a lot of your strongest people are going to stay on that. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is they quit because they want to work on, fancy cloud data technology and they go somewhere else, right? So best case scenario, you're spending time on that. And so I think it's quite imperative, even as we look at the cloud and the future and things like this, all right, let's kind of cut down our burn, investment on things on premise. I guess the only other aspect I would say on this is like, it's kind of what we said in the beginning, like the cloud data platforms, it is exciting and a genuine advance in technology, right? It also is something that's at the moment, like a little bit ungoverned, I would say, relative to things like understanding and forecasting spend on these cloud data platforms, extremely difficult. And so a lot of companies have tried to build, like there are early adopters, they've sort of built some things in-house to maintain this for one of their main cloud data platforms, but they haven't built it for the 6 others that they've started to use.
Right.
So I think that's another aspect where like it's very, it's very tangible. Like if you're a CDO and you're looking at this, like you don't, modern data stack this or that, right? But when you're burning through this amount of money, you need to quadruple your contract for next year. Like that's something that matters, right? And so there's some pretty acute, pain points, I guess, as you get into that CDO seat that we see recur across company and company.
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, like, it's very much tangible in terms of, where you can see how cost effective it is and how you could, obviously cut down on and reduce those operational costs. So it does make a lot of sense. And Tristan,
I'll tell you sorry. I was just gonna say another one, like this is another reason why like we kind of see these things like multidimensional when it comes together. So like one of the top questions, we sort of get asked, right, when we come in and say, hey, we'll show you what your landscape looks like. It's like, oh yeah, how much am I spending on these data sets, these queries that are just completely bad, right? Like, or how much am I spending on data sets that are never used? So I think like, if I'm spending this money on this stuff and it's significant money and I pay for every query, it starts to become quite salient, like what value am I getting out of this? And not just at the end of the year, do we do a review, but like every week, every month, what are we doing? Things like that. So it's a very exciting time to be in data, of course, and different excitements for different parts of the house. But it's good stuff all around.
Yeah, it is indeed. And this was great, Tristan. Obviously, I love the conversation that we've had. I can't wait for definitely a 2.0 session of having you on the Ravit Show. You've shared some amazing insights about data observability, about how Acceldata is obviously looking into this space and, just growing in this space. And the product that you guys are creating is fantastic, phenomenal out there. So can't wait. And just for our audience, if they want to reach out to you and learn more about data observability space, I know for a fact you are kind of you have a lot of knowledge in terms of the different roles, maybe data engineering in different spaces like MLOps. I know for a fact we still have that pending conversation where I would love to hear more things about MLOps in that space as well. So where can people reach out to you, Tristan? Which is the best place?
Yeah, anything's good. I mean, I'm certainly on LinkedIn. I'm also, love to talk to people at my company email, which is just my first name at acceldata.io. So
awesome.
Looking forward to hearing from people. Yep.
Yeah, can't wait. Thanks a lot for visiting the Ravit Show, Tristan. It was fantastic talking to you.
Thanks so much.